in the increasingly desperate final chapter of World War II. As the Allies marshaled their vast resources across the English Channel and the German war machine strained under the weight of years of attrition. One private, high-stakes meeting inside Adolf Hitler's fortified headquarters stands out as among the most tragically consequential moments of the entire conflict. It was there, in the dim, map-cluttered conference room of the Wolfschanze, or perhaps at the Berghof, surrounded by the silent, uneasy figures of senior generals and staff officers, that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the most famous and respected German commander still alive, made his last, impassioned, and ultimately futile attempt to avert the catastrophe he could see approaching with merciless clarity by the autumn of 1943. Hitler had grown increasingly anxious about the long-anticipated Second Front in Western Europe. In November, he summoned Rommel, fresh from the collapsing Italian theater, and charged him with the seemingly impossible task of inspecting, evaluating, and radically strengthening the so-called Atlantic Wall. Rommel, who had once dazzled the world with lightning campaigns in the deserts of North Africa, accepted the assignment with characteristic thoroughness and realism. On January 15, 1944, he formally took command of Army Group B, giving him operational responsibility for the most vulnerable stretch of coastline from the Scheldt estuary in the Netherlands to and through northern France to the mouth of the Loire. Rommel immediately launched an exhaustive inspection tour that lasted months. He traveled thousands of kilometers by staff car, train, and sometimes on foot, often in bitter winter weather, accompanied only by a small group of trusted aides, engineers, and naval officers. He climbed into half-finished bunkers, waded through mud along exposed beaches, examined minefields, studied obstacle belts, questioned local commanders, and interrogated construction supervisors. What he discovered contradicted every piece of propaganda the Reich had disseminated about its impregnable fortress Europe. The Atlantic Wall, for all its scale and ambition, was in reality a patchwork of ambitious plans, incomplete projects, and wishful thinking. Hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of concrete had been poured, yet thousands of gun emplacements, casemates, and command posts remained roofless, embrasureless, or entirely unbuilt. Labor shortages exacerbated by the constant drain of manpower to the Eastern Front combined with chronic shortages of cement, steel reinforcement, fuel for trucks, and even basic tools. Coastal artillery batteries had been hammered repeatedly by RAF and USAF raids, leaving many guns damaged or without sufficient ammunition. The infantry divisions assigned to static defense were a motley collection: elderly reservists, poorly trained conscripts, foreign volunteers from occupied territories, and recovering wounded men scarcely capable of sustained combat. Rommel paid special attention to the anti-landing obstacles that would have to bear the brunt of the first assault waves. Thousands upon thousands of steel Czech hedgehogs, concrete tetrahedra, Belgian gates, wooden stakes topped with mines soon dubbed Rommel's asparagus by Allied intelligence, and underwater ramps had been emplaced, but not nearly enough, and rarely in the optimal pattern. Large stretches of beach, especially in lower Normandy, remained sparsely obstructed. Minefields, which Rommel considered the single most effective weapon against landing craft and vehicles, had been laid in impressive numbers by May 1940 for more than 6 million mines dotted the coast, but enormous gaps persisted, particularly in the very sectors Rommel's instinct told him the Allies might choose. Yet the single greatest defect, in Rommel's judgment, lay not in the concrete or the mines but in the strategic disposition of Germany's armored reserves, having witnessed it firsthand in North Africa how overwhelming Allied air supremacy turned every daylight movement into a death trap, how columns of tanks and trucks were pinned, bombed, and strafed into immobility. Rommel drew the stark conclusion that the battle for France would be decided in the first 48 hours. And it would be decided on the beaches themselves, if the Allies could be thrown back into the sea during those critical opening hours. While they were still disorganized, lightly equipped, and dependent on naval gunfire, Germany might yet force a stalemate in the West. But if the invaders secured even a shallow lodgment, brought ashore tanks, heavy artillery, and supplies, and began to exploit their command of the air and the sea, no subsequent counterattack could succeed. This conviction put Rommel on a direct collision course with Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the crusty, old-school commander-in-chief West. Rundstedt, steeped in the classic Prussian tradition of mobile defense, insisted that the proper course was to hold the panzer divisions well inland, concentrated in a powerful CENTR, our reserve around Paris, then wait until the Allies had committed their main effort before launching a massive, coordinated armored counters-TROKE. Rommel argued with mounting urgency that such a plan was fantasy. In 1944, Allied fighter bombers and tactical air forces would destroy any large armored formation attempting to move forward during daylight. The Bocage country of Normandy, its dense hedgerows, sunken lanes, narrow bridges, and deliberately flooded marshlands would turn any large-scale armored advance into a nightmare of ambushes and traffic jams, even without air attack. Only by positioning the panzer divisions immediately behind the most threatened beaches could Germany deliver the rapid, overwhelming tactical blow needed to crush the invasion before it could consolidate. Rommel took his case higher and higher. He bombarded OKW with detailed memoranda. He held tense conferences with Rundstedt, with the panzer group commanders, with the Luftwaffe liaison officers. Above all, he sought repeated private audiences with Hitler himself. Those meetings were formal, almost ritualistic affairs. Hitler would sit at the head of the enormous map table, sometimes hunched over in pain from his various ailments, while Rommel, standing erect in his long leather greatcoat, delivered his assessment with the bluntness of a soldier who had seen too much death to mince words in. One especially critical audience, likely in late March or early April 1944, Rommel laid it all bare. The fortifications were inadequate, the minefields were incomplete, the obstacles were poorly sighted. Most damning of all, the panzer divisions were positioned too far back, sometimes 80 to 150 kilometers from the coast. He named the formations he considered essential. The 21st Panzer Division, already near Cannes, the superbly equipped Panzerlehr Division, the fanatical 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Juge Endy, perhaps even elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. He pleaded for authority to move them forward immediately, to dig them in behind the most vulnerable sectors, especially around the Cotentin Peninsula, the Calvados coast, and the Orne estuary. He warned that Allied air supremacy meant German armor would never reach the beaches in daylight once the invasion began. The war, he said, would be won or lost in the first 24 hours. Delay would be fatal. Hitler listened, occasionally asking sharp questions, but his answers were always the same. He remained fixated on the Pas de Calais as the real invasion site, convinced by the elaborate Allied deception operations that any landing in Normandy could only be a feint or diversion. A larger, more powerful second wave would follow at the narrowest point of the channel, where the V-1 launch sites and the bulk of 15th Army were concentrated. Therefore, he insisted, the panzer reserves must remain centralized so they could be thrown against the decisive blow. In a characteristic gesture of distrust and micromanagement, Hitler retained personal control over the movement of every major armored unit. Not even Rommel could shift a single division without OKW and ultimately the FHR's explicit approval. The room grew heavy with unspoken tension. Senior officers stood along the walls, faces impassive, eyes fixed on the maps, knowing full well that the argument was over before it had truly begun. Rommel pressed once more, voice low but firm. Hesitation would doom the West. Hitler cut him off with a wave of the hand. The meeting ended without concession. Rommel returned to his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon shaken but undeterred. He drove his men even harder, ordering round-the-clock work on obstacles, mines, and field fortifications right up to the final days. Yet he knew the odds were turning decisively against him on the afternoon of June 5, 1944. With gale force winds and heavy seas pounding the channel, Rommel concluded that no invasion could be launched in such weather. Believing he had a brief window, he left for Germany to celebrate his wife Lucy's 50th birthday and, if possible, to secure one final audience with Hitler to renew his plea for forward deployed armor early on the morning of June 6, while Rommel was still hundreds of kilometers away. The greatest amphibious operation in history began. 5 Allied divisions stormed ashore on the beaches of Normandy. The panzer reserves Rommel had fought so hard to reposition remained immobilized, paralyzed first by Hitler's refusal to release them without personal confirmation, then by the FHR's late rising and his lingering belief that this was merely the diversion he had expected. When OKW finally authorized movement in the late afternoon, the moment had passed. The 21st Panzer Division attacked Neerken with what forces it could muster, but it fought alone and without adequate support. By the time the 12th SS, Panzerlehr, and other reinforcements arrived, battered by incessant air attack, delayed by traffic jams, and exhausted, they found the Allies already ashore in strength, linking their beachheads, and beginning the methodical buildup that would soon break out into the French interior. Within weeks the entire Western Front began to disintegrate. Paris was liberated in August. The road to the German border lay open. Rommel himself never regained command. On July 17, 1944, a low-flying Spitfire strafed his open Hochstaff car near the village of Saint-Foy-de-Montgomery, inflicting grievous head wounds. His tangential contacts with the conspirators of July 20 sealed his fate. In October, given the choice between a public show trial and a quiet death, he took cyanide to spare his family further suffering. In the end, that single, fateful meeting where a commander who had earned the respect of friend and foe alike tried one last time to force reality upon a dictator lost in fantasy became a microcosm of the Third Reich's collapse. Rommel had seen the decisive moment coming with a clarity few others possessed. He had argued, pleaded, and warned with every shred of his authority, and he had been ignored. The consequence was not merely the fall of France or the opening of Germany's western frontier. It was the irrevocable acceleration of the war's end, the liberation of millions, and the final unraveling of a regime that had preferred delusion to uncomfortable truth. The legacy of that ignored warning still echoes. A brilliant soldier who understood exactly what was at stake, who fought desperately to change the outcome, and who watched the catastrophe unfold knowing he had done everything in his power yet still failed to Move the one mine that mattered most.